Hey, what's good, people? Mr. Zensher here, back again with another renoise tutorial. Probably a quick one today. Just wanted to show you guys the use of the convolver in perhaps some unconventional ways for sound design purposes, maybe more advanced sound design purposes, or an easy way to get some interesting results imparting different qualities of sound on an otherwise boring sound source. So what is convolution? It is essentially the imparting of one sound onto the character of another. And it does this by basically multiplying the spectral content of one sound by another. So it's kind of a form of cross-synthesis, but it's not using oscillatory waveforms. It's just using the spectral characteristics of sound. So it can be a little CPU heavy, depending on the size of the waveform that you're using as your impulse response. But it can create some really interesting effects, especially when used kind of more unconventionally. Traditionally and typically, convolution is used to emulate reverbs, reverberant spaces, and people will capture the spectral characteristics of different reverberant spaces, like a cathedral or a bridge underpass or a forest or whatever, using either like a clap or a balloon pop or an impulse response gun, which just generates a short burst of white noise. Sometimes people will use like a sine sweep as well, but more typically when people are doing field recording for impulse responses, they just use a short burst of white noise or something approximating that. And that's all well and good, and you can create some really beautiful and organic reverbs with convolvers. But I wanted to show you maybe some different applications for the convolver to kind of radically transform your sound sources and up your sound design game really easily and quickly and simply. So I've just got a break loop loaded here. This is what the dry, unaffected signal sounds like. Pretty good stuff. That's the Honey Drippers break. And in our instrument effects section, I've just added the convolver. You can do this in the track section, wherever you want it. And the convolver device has a fairly simple set of controls, and these controls on the left are macro assignable, and these controls on the right are not. And you can kind of see that they're set into the device itself and are not able to be modulated via automation or macro control. And if we pull up our macros and try to assign it, you can see we just have these four: the Predelay, color, dry mix, and wet mix available. Which is all well and good, but it is a limitation of the convolver device that we can't change these parameters on the fly. So the first thing we want to do with the convolver is load up an impulse response using this load button here, and it'll direct us to the folder that we want to use, and I'm just going to use my impulse response folder here. Now, as I was saying, usually people use the convolver for reverbs, but I found that you can get all kinds of interesting sonic results by using different impulse responses. So I've had kind of created a collection of different Foley sounds and different things here to convolve my sound sources. So let's just kind of go through some of these, and you can hear how the convolution affects the original sound. Right, so there's this kind of longer recording of a knife scraping on some ceramics. And say we wanted to shorten this up, we could just take our length slider down. And this color slider is really useful. There's a low pass filter to the left and a high pass filter to the right. So if we wanted to darken this up, right? So right out of the gate, we have kind of a useful transformation if we take our dry slider down. we've kind of radically transformed the sound really simply. We can also change this resampling. This is basically affecting the pitch of the impulse response, and we can take it down an octave or up an octave. And this is essentially just repitching the impulse response, so your length values will change accordingly. So if it's pitched up, it's going to be shorter. If it's pitched down, it's going to be longer. So you can, if you want to keep it tight, you have to dial your length down accordingly. So I'll just go through some various impulse responses and show you that depending on your sound source, you can really get some interesting results. And sometimes the volume is an issue because this is multiplicative. So if you have a lot of bass frequencies in your impulse response and bass frequencies in your source material, they're going to multiply and you may have some issues there. So this gain slider comes in handy there. We also have this start slider, which allows us to determine at what point in the waveform our impulse response begins playback. So this is kind of like the sample offset. And this only goes to 50%. I wish it went to 100%, but hey, it's better than nothing. So you can hear that we've kind of created this strange, like reverberant timbral delay just by using a different sound source. So what I like to do is kind of collect interesting sounds and throw them in my impulse response folder. And that way I can just grab all kinds of different sonic environments. And, some of them are going to apply better than others, depending on what you're going for. Some of them function more like a reverb. You could resample that and maybe time stretch it and have this really interesting, kind of ambient soundscape or atmosphere. But you can also, let me see if I can find one here. Oh, here's fire. This is kind of fun. You can literally set your beats on fire. And of course, depending on your length slider, it'll essentially like play out the impulse response file. So if you have, like a long impulse response and you have a short sound source, you can kind of time stretch it in a way or filter it, using this cross synthesis of convolution to kind of take the spectra of one sound and morph it into another. But let me see if I can find, oh yeah, here we go. So if you have an impulse response that has a lot of like timbral characteristics or a lot of tonal characteristics, it's almost like a comb filter or a short delay line. Kind of some interesting effects there. And depending on the sound source, like this is a a pitch modulated version of that same sine pulse. Right, you can have a, like a comb delay with some tremolo on it, or some vibrato on it. And if if your piece of music is in a specific key, or if you're composing harmonically, you can then create custom impulse responses that are in the key of your song or resonant with the harmonic of your song, and run various sound sources through them to create this kind of harmonic cohesion, or to have like a harmonic filtration of the sound so that it all kind of gels together. You can also, try and dial it in by ear using this resample slider. There's a lot of possibility there. Let's see, what else have we got? This one I think is more of an ambience. But you can hear just how varied the results can be. Let me just see if I can find another interesting one that I wanted to share. Oh, you can make your own like custom reverbs. This is just pink noise. We also have this Predelay slider, which you can use for kind of like some interesting delay effects, depending on the timing of your source material. And whatever, you'd have to dial it in. You can do your BPM to millisecond conversion. But it can also be really interesting to use single cycle waveforms, or even like sequences of pitches. So let's see if we can get this one sounding interesting here. So I find that there's just a lot of fertile ground for exploration in terms of what you're using as your impulse response to get some really unconventional results that go far beyond reverbs. Using Foley sounds or field recordings can easily like impart a lot of organic sonic characteristics, which is often like something that's difficult to achieve with electronic music. That can, make your sound a lot more sophisticated, or, advanced in terms of their sound design in a really kind of easy and simple way. So I've been finding myself using the convolver quite a bit lately, just to add some, more organic character, kind of unusual timbral qualities to different aspects of sound design. And you do want to keep an eye on your CPU counter. If it's running too high or too hot, dial your length down. If you have a long impulse response, it basically has to calculate that pretty frequently, depending on your sound source. So do keep that in mind when you're using convolution. But I find the renoise convolver to be pretty CPU efficient. So I tend to kind of throw it all throughout projects. Another thing I wanted to show you is the use of drum samples as impulse responses. So it can be fun to, like throw a kick drum or something on there. So that's the entire drum loop being filtered through the sound of a kick drum. And, just whatever variety of different kicks. Other percussion elements can be really interesting too, like claps or snares can have some nice kind of like crunchy brightness to them, especially if you dial down the length. So if we compare that to the original, pretty dry. Let's dial this down even further. Maybe bring the gain up. I don't know, I think that's kind of cool. It's almost like a saturation distortion or something that brings out some of the higher harmonics. And of course, you can make your own custom impulse responses, and this is totally what I would encourage. Rhythmic impulse responses that are at the BPM of your song project, resampled bits of your song, and then running other sound sources through it. I mean, really, there's a ton of creative potential using the convolver. So yeah, I think that's about what I have for you today. You can also try running single cycle waveforms as your impulse response, and that can impart some interesting timbral characteristics. Let's just check into that briefly before we depart here. Let's go to samples, building blocks, perfect waves. Yeah, it usually helps to have multiple cycles, but you can, kind of color the sound using different waveforms as your impulse response. So there's a lot of room to play around and experiment and have fun. So yeah, I hope this was useful for some of you. Definitely experiment with the convolver if you haven't been using it. I think it's really slept on and underrated, especially if you start getting creative with your impulse response files. Obviously, you got to kind of like watch your levels. Levels were jumping all around throughout the video, but that's just what it is. All right. Hope this was useful for you. Keep being awesome. Make lots of music. Catch you next time. Peace.